Snow fell in Briar's End the way secrets settle in quiet villages, softly at first, then all at once. Miss Marple stood near the entrance of the Briar's End town hall, brushing snowflakes from her knitted gloves as she admired the warm glow spilling from the windows. The annual Christmas charity ball was usually a joyful affair, a place where neighbors embraced, children performed carols, and the mayor made his boastful speeches while the villagers pretended not to mind. But tonight, something felt wrong. She sensed it the moment she stepped inside. The mayor's wife, Eleanor Whitcomb, usually a pillar of poise, stood rigid near the refreshments table, her eyes red. Her hands, delicate and trembling, clutched a glass of untouched mulled wine. When she saw Miss Marple, she quickly looked away, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple noticed the gesture. And she noticed the way no one else did. Across the room, Counselor Hartley, lean, ambitious, and always pretending to be too busy for pleasantries, watched the mayor with a gaze a little too hungry. His mouth was fixed in a thin line, one hand tightening around a folded document he refused to put down. Near the stage, the town florist, young Michael Pritchard, twisted his apron strings with nervous fingers. His entire Christmas display, wreaths, garlands, blooms brought in from greenhouses, was a masterpiece, yet his eyes darted about as if terrified someone might pull it all apart. And then there was the stranger. A woman in an emerald dress stood near the mistletoe arch, her back impossibly straight, her eyes too sharp to belong to a festive gathering. She had introduced herself earlier as Mrs. Green, but Miss Marple knew a fake name when she heard one. She spoke with the elegance of someone who had practiced being forgettable. Miss Marple's instincts hummed. The room was buzzing with holiday cheer, but beneath it ran a second, deeper current, quiet tension, muffled resentments, faces too tight with worry. Then the lights flickered. The chandeliers dimmed, brightened, then gave a violent shudder as the entire hall plunged into a gasp-filled darkness. Several people shrieked. Glasses clinked. A violin screeched as someone dropped it. Miss Marple did not move. Her breath was steady, her instincts sharpened. She listened. Beneath the murmurs and confusion, a single, soft thud reached her ears. And then the lights came back on. A collective cry rose from the crowd. Beneath the enormous mistletoe arch, intricately woven by the florist just hours earlier, lay Mayor Whitcomb. His festive waistcoat was dusted with fallen mistletoe berries, his outstretched hand frozen in an eerie reach toward the ceiling. Dead. Miss Marple hurried forward, the surrounding chaos melting into a clear, cold moment. People backed away, as if the air itself had turned dangerous. She crouched beside the body. His pockets bulged slightly. With the gentlest touch, she retrieved two strange objects. A torn invitation, ripped clean in half, and a broken red ornament, its glass edges sharp, a peculiar little symbol painted on one shard. She held them both in her gloved hands, her expression quiet, thoughtful, deeply sad. Because this was no accident. And it was not a crime of passion. It was a message. Miss Marple rose, eyes drifting to each suspect in turn. Eleanor Whitcomb, staring in horror, but with a grief that seemed layered and complicated. Counselor Hartley, jaw clenched, fingers whitening around that folded document. Michael the florist, shivering, as though his own decorations had betrayed him. Mrs. Green, the stranger, gazing at the scene with an unsettling calm. Miss Marple inhaled. Christmas had always been a time for miracles in Briar's End. Tonight, it would be a time for revealing truths. "Very well," she murmured softly. "Let us begin." The hall had fallen into a stunned, trembling silence, broken only by the distant hum of the generator struggling to keep the lights steady. Snow tapped softly against the windows, as if the world outside were politely asking what terrible thing had just occurred. Miss Marple stood, hands clasped gently before her, and surveyed the shaken faces around her. It was always this moment, the first breath after tragedy, when truth and lies first began to separate themselves. She turned first to Eleanor Whitcomb. The mayor's widow stood utterly motionless, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were wide, but grief alone did not fill them. There was something else. Something sharper. Something that flickered with every tremor in her breath. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Miss Marple said softly, "were you and your husband together before the lights went out?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, he stepped away. He said he needed—" her voice cracked. "He needed a moment." "To do what?" Counselor Hartley cut in, his tone too quick, too eager. Eleanor's gaze snapped to him. "I don't know." But Miss Marple caught the smallest hesitation, the faintest echo of knowledge not yet spoken. She tucked it gently away. Next, she approached Hartley. The counselor's jaw tightened as she neared, as though bracing for accusations that had not yet been made. "Counselor," Miss Marple said, her voice the kind of polite that was far too precise to be harmless, "may I inquire about the paper you've been holding?" He blinked, then lifted his chin in defiance. "It is a proposal. A redevelopment plan I intended to present tonight." "A redevelopment that opposes the mayor's?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated, just for a beat. "Yes." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Rivals, then?" "I wouldn't say that." He swallowed. "Not anymore." Her eyes flicked, very briefly, to the mistletoe arch. Just enough to unsettle him. Then she moved on. Michael Pritchard, the florist, was nearly vibrating with nerves. His hands twisted his apron strings with frantic energy, the cotton already stretched thin. "Mr. Pritchard," she said gently, "you arranged the decorations?" He nodded quickly. "Yes, yes, ma'am. The wreaths, the garlands, and the mistletoe arch." His eyes darted to the arch where the mayor still lay beneath its heavy shadow. "Was the structure stable?" Miss Marple asked. "It should have been," he stammered. I built it carefully. I always do. But tonight," she said quietly, "you seem afraid." Michael swallowed. Hard. I didn't do anything wrong." Miss Marple did not respond. She simply allowed silence to draw its own confession. And then, the stranger. Mrs. Green. A woman whose emerald dress reflected the lights like polished glass. She stood apart from the group, her posture too controlled, her stillness too deliberate. Miss Marple approached her last. "You are far from home, Mrs. Green." The woman smiled faintly. "One might say that. You did not give the organizers a full name." "Privacy is a luxury," the woman murmured. "I value it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And how did you come to know the mayor?" Something, just a flicker, shifted in the woman's expression. "I didn't," she said calmly. "A lie." Miss Marple felt it rather than observed it. She watched the woman's gaze drop to the torn invitation in her hand. For only a second. Only enough to betray a memory. Miss Marple tucked the clues closer to her chest. A torn invitation. A broken ornament with a strange symbol. A perfectly timed blackout. A body positioned beneath a decorative arch built to collapse or strike at just the right moment. And 4 suspects, each carrying secrets sharper than glass. She raised her chin, her voice gentle but firm. "No one leaves this hall," she said. "Not until we understand what has happened." The snow outside thickened, sealing the building in white. Inside, under the glow of Christmas lights and tragedy, the truth began to stir. The hall emptied of music, laughter, and festivities had become a strange cathedral of echoes, echoes of gasps, of hurried whispers, of a life ending beneath bright holiday decorations. The volunteers had stepped back, forming a loose circle near the doors while Miss Marple moved with her gentle, unhurried precision. The mayor's body had been respectfully covered, but Miss Marple's mind was far from finished with him. She crouched once more beneath the towering mistletoe arch, tracing her fingertips, not touching, merely observing, along the fallen berries scattered like tiny green drops of punctuation around the scene. Michael Pritchard hovered nearby, pale as candle wax. "This arch," Miss Marple began softly. "How was it supported?" Michael blinked hard. "The frame is hollow metal tubing. Lightweight. I reinforced it with wires, thin steel wires that are nearly invisible from a distance." "Nearly invisible," Miss Marple echoed thoughtfully. "And could someone tamper with them?" He hesitated. "Yes, if they knew where to look." Miss Marple followed the lines of the arch with her eyes, noting points where tension might be redirected, pulled, timed. She stored the thought carefully. Then she turned her attention to the broken ornament. It had fallen from the mayor's pocket when she checked him earlier. Now, she examined each sharp fragment laid carefully on a linen napkin. Most were painted red, but one shard bore a small painted symbol, an intersecting pair of lines forming an elegantly simple mark. A mark she recognized. But she said nothing yet. Instead, she examined the torn invitation. Half the card, the mayor's name proudly printed at the top, the rest ripped away in clean fury. The torn edge was jagged, emotional, exacting. Someone had not simply rejected him. Someone had wanted him to know he was being rejected. She rose and crossed toward Counselor Hartley, who stood at the refreshment table, tapping the edge of his folded redevelopment plan as though drumming out nerves. "Your proposal," Miss Marple said gently, "would it have displaced certain homeowners?" Hartley stiffened. "Progress always asks something of someone." "Progress," Miss Marple murmured. "Or ambition?" His jaw worked. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Oh no," she said pleasantly. "Not yet." She turned away before he could speak again. A tactic she'd learned long ago, leaving a guilty man with his unfinished outrage often revealed more than questioning him directly. Next, she found Eleanor Whitcomb sitting heavily on a chair by the stage, her lace handkerchief crushed in her hand. "You loved him," Miss Marple said quietly. Eleanor's eyes filled instantly. "I did, even when he made it difficult. And lately," Miss Marple added. Eleanor turned her head away. Snowlight from the tall windows cast soft illumination across her profile, making the sadness more visible, more fragile. "He'd been acting strangely," Eleanor finally whispered. "Secretive. Distracted. He kept something from me. But I thought it was another project. Another plan. I never imagined," her voice broke. "I never imagined he'd die tonight." Miss Marple sat beside her, not touching but close enough to offer warmth. "You mentioned he stepped away earlier," Miss Marple said gently. "Do you know why?" Eleanor closed her eyes. "He received a note. Someone wanted to meet him under the mistletoe arch." Miss Marple inhaled. Not in shock. She had expected something of the sort, but in quiet confirmation. A trap, then. Set with care. Perfectly timed. Designed for emotional impact as much as physical. Finally, she rose and crossed to Mrs. Green, the stranger, who watched the investigation with unsettling calm. "You seem very composed," Miss Marple noted. "I am accustomed to tragedy," Mrs. Green replied. "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice light as snow, "you know something of the mayor's secrets." Mrs. Green's gaze flicked once more to the ornament pieces, especially the shard with the symbol. And that was all Miss Marple needed. The truth, faint as a candle flame but growing brighter, had begun to form in her mind. There was a pattern, a message, a signal, and someone was very afraid she had seen it. Outside, snow fell in thick, drifting sheets, muffling the world beyond the town hall. Inside, the Christmas lights flickered softly, halos of gold hovering above a room thick with tension. Miss Marple stood at the center, hands folded neatly, her expression thoughtful, almost tender. It was remarkable how calm she remained when chaos swirled at the edges. She had all 4 suspects brought closer. They formed a ragged semicircle before her, each wearing a different face of fear. Eleanor Whitcomb's grief was raw and untamed, though her eyes held a shadow of something else. Hurt, yes, but also betrayal. Counselor Hartley looked restless, the fingers of one hand twitching against the folded redevelopment plan he still refused to put down. Michael Pritchard wrung his apron strings until they curled like tortured ribbon. And Mrs. Green, the stranger, watched Miss Marple with an unreadable composure. A woman who had prepared her expressions carefully, the way others prepared travel bags. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "I should like," she began, "to ask you each a very small question." She turned first to Michael. "You built the Mistletoe arch with steel wires. Tell me, was the top crossbar heavy?" He swallowed. "And not very. But if the wires were pulled sharply enough, it would fall forward." "Precisely," Miss Marple said with a faint nod. She moved to Hartley. "And your rivalry with the mayor, it was professional?" Hartley bristled. "Of course. Not personal." His silence was as meaningful as a confession. "Then, Eleanor." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Your husband received a note calling him to the arch. Did you see it?" Eleanor hesitated. "No. He hid it from me." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. Her eyes warmed with sympathy, but sympathy laced with comprehension. "And did he hide other things as well?" Eleanor's breath caught. A single tear spilled. She did not answer. Last, Mrs. Green. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "You recognize the symbol painted on the ornament, do you not?" Mrs. Green's composure flickered, just once. "I don't know what you mean." But she did. Oh, she did. Miss Marple looked down at the shard again. 2 intersecting lines in a distinct angle, an old symbol used in discreet circles to signal private meetings or urgent personal matters. Not widely known. Only a few would recognize it. And someone had used it to lure the mayor to his death. She turned back to the group, her voice calm and clear. The ornament was not decoration. It was a signal. Someone placed it in the mayor's pocket earlier tonight to instruct him where to go. And the torn invitation. She lifted the half-card delicately. This was not an accident either. It tells us that meeting was not meant to be cordial. Whispers rose among the bystanders. Snow pressed harder against the windows, sealing them all in a bubble of cold dread. Miss Marple stepped toward the mistletoe arch, pointing gently to the wires Michael had mentioned. Invisible tension lines crisscrossed the frame, competently made, yet easy to manipulate by someone skilled. This contraption did not fall on its own. Someone timed it perfectly. The blackout, the noise, the panic, everything provided cover to pull a single wire and send the top bar falling with force. Michael gasped softly. Someone must have known the structure well. Miss Marple nodded. Or had reason to study it during the preparations. Someone who moved freely between decorations, guests, and private conversations. Her eyes traveled across each suspect with quiet certainty. There is one among you who understands signals, who arrived under a false name, who knew the mayor well enough to summon him discreetly, who positioned themselves during the blackout exactly where the wire could be pulled unseen. She turned fully to Mrs. Green. "You, my dear." The hall fell into a hush so complete it rang like a struck bell. But Miss Marple raised a hand. "I have not yet explained why." She inhaled softly. "Because the motive, I believe, is not political nor financial." Her eyes softened. "But heartbreak." Mrs. Green's mask shuddered. Eleanor froze. Hartley's knuckles whitened. Michael gasped, and the snow outside fell harder, as if urging the truth to land at last. The silence that followed Miss Marple's accusation was a living thing, stretching, tightening, coiling around every person in the hall. Mrs. Green did not flinch. Not yet. But the air around her seemed to shift, as though her poise had finally developed a crack too fine to hide. Eleanor Whitcomb stared at the woman with a dawning horror, and something that looked dangerously close to recognition. Counselor Hartley looked between them, his eyes narrowing as if trying to knit together pieces he suddenly realized he had always possessed. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "It is quite simple," she began softly, "when one stops looking at the mechanics of the crime and starts looking at the emotions behind it." She stepped closer to Mrs. Green. "You arrived in Briar's End under a false name. You spoke little, yet you observed much. And when the mayor was found dead, you did not react with shock, but with quiet resignation." Mrs. Green's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice a calm thread weaving truth. "The symbol on the broken ornament is not widely known. It is used among certain discreet correspondents, those who wish to meet privately, away from the public eye. Lovers, former partners, individuals bound by complicated pasts." A ripple swept through the hall. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Miss Marple lowered her voice. "You knew the mayor intimately." Mrs. Green finally looked away, the first break in her unshakable facade. Miss Marple pressed on. "When you saw him tonight, you expected a private word, perhaps reconciliation, perhaps closure. But instead, her eyes softened. He tore your invitation in anger. That explains why half of it was found in his pocket." Mrs. Green's voice emerged in a whisper, brittle and thin. He said we would speak, that he needed time." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple continued gently but firmly. "And yet he kept leading you on. He kept promising something he never intended to give. When he realized you traveled here to confront him, on Christmas, no less, he panicked. He tore up your invitation. Perhaps he even threatened you." Mrs. Green shuddered. "He said I was a mistake he could not afford any more." A breath of pain escaped her. Not guilt. Pain. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And in that moment, the heart breaks in ways logic cannot contain." The room was still. Moved. Uneasy. "But heartbreak alone does not lead to murder," Miss Marple continued, her tone tightening. "No, something else acted as a catalyst." Her gaze slid toward Eleanor. The mayor's widow looked pale, but she lifted her chin. "I knew nothing of this woman," she breathed. Miss Marple smiled softly. "Yes, my dear, you did." Eleanor froze. "Your husband's secrecy," Miss Marple went on, "was not entirely hidden. You knew he had been meeting someone who threatened the fragile image he so fiercely protected." Hartley's eyes widened. "So the wife—" "No," Miss Marple said sharply but kindly. "Not the wife." She turned back to Mrs. Green. "You arranged the meeting beneath the mistletoe arch. You signaled him with the ornament. You intended a confrontation only." Mrs. Green swallowed, tears now slipping down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. I wanted him to face me, to admit what he'd promised." Miss Marple's voice softened even more. "And someone else saw their chance." A collective breath filled the hall. "Someone," Miss Marple said, "who knew where you would be, who followed you, who understood the decoration wires, who used your meeting as perfect cover." Her eyes shifted, slowly, towards the most frightened person in the room. Michael Pritchard, the florist. His face drained to chalk. Miss Marple," he stammered. She spoke gently. You didn't intend to kill the mayor. But emotions twist quietly around the lonely heart, do they not? You saw him speaking harshly to Mrs. Green. You heard things not meant for you. And you knew how fragile the arch structure could be. Michael backed away, trembling violently. It was an accident, he whispered in horror. I only pulled the wire to scare him, just to make the arch shake, just to interrupt. Silence. And when the blackout hit, Miss Marple finished softly, your small tug became deadly. Michael collapsed into a chair, covering his face. Mrs. Green stared at him, devastated. Eleanor let out a weak sob, and Miss Marple stood very still, sorrow deep in her eyes. It was heartbreak that set events in motion, she said quietly. But it was a lonely heart that delivered the final blow. Outside, the snow began to lighten, its fury spent. Inside, the truth had finally fallen. Michael Pritchard sat crumpled in the chair, as though the truth had peeled the strength from his limbs. The hall, once filled with the promise of carols and laughter, felt heavier than stone. Snow light filtered through the tall windows in softened streaks, and for a moment, it felt as though even winter were holding its breath. Miss Marple stepped toward the trembling young man, not with accusation, but with a gentleness that made those watching fall silent. Mr. Pritchard, she said, her voice warm but unwavering, accidents born of emotion are still tragedies that must be faced. He shook his head, tears streaking his cheeks. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted him to stop shouting at her. He was cruel, and she looked so afraid. His eyes flicked to Mrs. Green, whose gaze softened with complicated grief. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You felt protective. I heard him, Michael whispered. I heard how he spoke to her behind the arch. I heard him call her a burden, a mistake. I couldn't bear it. The room felt the weight of the confession. And when the lights went out, Miss Marple continued, you thought pulling on the wire would merely shake the arch, interrupt the moment. Michael let out a broken sob. But the crossbar was heavier than I realized. The wires must have loosened earlier when I hung the last of the garlands, or maybe I tied one wrong. I don't know. He covered his face again. I didn't check. I was careless. Miss Marple's expression softened with genuine sorrow. Grief, she murmured, is a shadow that follows us all eventually. But guilt can swallow us whole if we let it. Eleanor Whitcomb stepped forward then. The mayor's wife, her lace handkerchief crumpled and forgotten, looked at the broken young florist with an expression that surprised everyone. Compassion. He was not a kind man, she said quietly. Not to me. Not always to others. She looked toward Mrs. Green, who stood rooted, trembling. You were not the first he hurt. I see that now. Mrs. Green bowed her head, shame threading through her breath. The villagers shifted uneasily, their anger softening into something more complex. Heartbreak had moved through all of them tonight, some directly, some through secrets years in the making. Miss Marple clasped her hands gently. Michael, she said, you must take responsibility for what happened. Not because you are wicked, but because tragedy, even unintentional, cannot be ignored. Michael nodded, swallowing hard. I will. I'll tell the constable everything. Hartley, once rigid with self-interest, exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. The scandal, the fallout, it will be terrible for Briar's End. Miss Marple looked at him with mild reproach. A man has died, counselor. The truth deserves its place, even if it disrupts Christmas. He nodded, chastened. Mrs. Green stepped closer to Michael, her voice barely a breath. You tried to protect me. You shouldn't have, but I understand why you did. Her eyes shimmered. I'm sorry this happened. Michael gave a small, devastated nod. Eleanor approached too, her hands trembling at her sides. "We all lost something tonight," she whispered. "Perhaps, in time, we'll find a way to forgive one another." Miss Marple watched them with a quiet sadness. Christmas lights blinked gently overhead, casting tiny halos of red and gold upon the floor, softening the hard outlines of grief. "Christmas," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, "has always been a season of contrasts. Light and shadow, joy and sorrow, truth and forgiveness." She stepped toward the tall windows and gazed out at the snow-covered village streets. Briar's End glowed softly beneath lanterns, serene and oblivious to the tragedy unfolding within its heart. Then she turned back to the room. "Come," she said gently. "Let us bring in the constable, and let Christmas morning arrive with honesty, so that healing may begin." The villagers moved slowly toward the doors, hearts heavy but no longer clouded by fear. Mrs. Green lingered in the doorway, looking once more at the mistletoe arch, now nothing more than a fallen decoration. Miss Marple watched her a moment longer. "Take heart, my dear," she said softly. "Even broken things can lead us back to the truth." The woman nodded, tears glistening, and stepped out into the snow. Miss Marple followed, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cold air met her warmly, strangely enough. For though this Christmas carried sorrow, it also carried clarity. And in Briar's End, clarity was the greatest gift of all. The end. In Briar's End, the snow eventually melted, but the lessons of that Christmas night remained like delicate footprints across the village's memory. Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and gentle persistence, reminded everyone that even the most festive nights can hide the deepest truths. And sometimes, the most fragile hearts carry the heaviest burdens. But that is the magic and the mystery of life. Light always returns. Truth always rises. And healing, no matter how slow, always blooms again. Thank you for joining us on this journey through love, heartbreak, and revelation under the mistletoe. If you enjoyed this story and want more slow-burning mysteries, emotional twists, and elegant unravelings just like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more episodes on Mysteries and Roses. Your support helps us continue crafting the stories you love, filled with suspense, romance, and unforgettable endings. Until our next unraveling, stay curious, stay kind, and keep your heart open to every mystery life brings.